Million-dollar mistake, the show jumper who came home. The November wind cut across the rolling hills of western Kentucky with a bite that promised an early winter. Rowan Fletcher stood in the doorway of his modest barn, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the sunrise paint the frost-covered pastures in shades of amber and rose. At 43, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd spent more years working the land than he cared to count. The small family farm had been his inheritance, 20 acres of stubborn clay soil, a century-old farmhouse that leaked when it rained, and memories of better times when his grandfather had run a modest horse-breeding operation. Those days were long gone. Now, Rowan scraped by with a handful of rescue horses, boarding a neighbor's aging mare, and seasonal work at the larger farms that dotted the bluegrass region. It was honest work, if lonely, ever since his divorce 3 years prior had left him with the farm and little else. The rumble of a diesel engine broke the morning silence. Rowan squinted toward the dirt road, watching an enormous horse trailer navigate the potholes with expensive precision. The rig was immaculate, gleaming white with chrome accents and a logo he didn't recognize. It was the kind of equipment that belonged at Churchill Downs or Keeneland, not his rundown operation. "You lost?" Rowan called out as a driver in pristine coveralls emerged from the cab, clipboard in hand. The man, perhaps 30 with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own competence, barely glanced up. "Fletcher Farm. Got a delivery for you." "I didn't order anything." Rowan set down his coffee, already walking toward the trailer. "You sure you got the right place?" "Says right here, Fletcher Farm, 2847 Old Mill Road." The driver tapped his clipboard. "Sign here." "There's gotta be a mistake. I can't afford—" The sharp whinny from inside the trailer cut him off. It was a sound of pure aristocracy, the vocalization of an animal that had never known hardship. The driver was already lowering the ramp, his movements practiced and efficient. "Look, buddy, I got 3 more deliveries today. Horse goes here, paperwork says so. Any issues? Take it up with Thornhill Equestrian Transport." He produced a card and thrust it toward Rowan before disappearing into the trailer. What emerged took Rowan's breath away. She was magnificent. A Dutch warm-blood mare, the color of polished mahogany, her coat gleaming even in the pale morning light. Every line of her body spoke of careful breeding, expensive training, and a life of professional care. Her presence transformed his shabby barnyard into something approaching legitimate. The mare held her head high, nostrils flaring as she surveyed her surroundings with intelligent dark eyes. "Jesus," Rowan breathed. The driver was already back in his cab, engine starting. "Paperwork's in the envelope on the saddle. Good luck." Before Rowan could protest further, the trailer was rumbling back down the road, leaving him standing in a cloud of dust with a horse that probably cost more than his entire property. The mare stamped a hoof, her shoe striking a perfect note against the hard-packed dirt. She turned her elegant head toward the barn, and something in her posture shifted. The nervous energy that had radiated from her during unloading seemed to evaporate. Her ears swiveled forward, and she took a tentative step toward the weathered structure. Then another, and another. Rowan grabbed the lead rope that had been left looped over the fence post. "Whoa there, girl. Let's figure this out." But the mare wasn't spooked or confused. If anything, she seemed purposeful. She pulled gently but insistently toward the barn, her powerful muscles moving beneath her coat with fluid grace. Rowan had worked with enough horses to recognize the difference between an animal that was frightened and one that was determined. He let her lead him to the barn door. The moment they crossed the threshold, the mare stopped. Her entire body went still, except for her head, which moved slowly from left to right as if cataloguing every beam, every stall, every shadow. The morning light filtered through gaps in the old boards, creating stripes of gold across her coat. Then she did something that made the hair on Rowan's arms stand up. She walked directly to the third stall on the left, the one he used for storage because the door hung crooked and the latch was broken. Without hesitation, without guidance, she positioned herself in front of it and turned to look at him expectantly. "How did you—" Rowan trailed off. He pulled out the envelope the driver had mentioned. Inside was a thick packet of documents. Health certificates, breeding records, competition history. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. This was Elowin's Eclipse, a 6-year-old mare with an impeccable pedigree and a show-jumping record that included international competitions. Her estimated value was listed at $1, $2 million, and she was supposed to be delivered to Fletcher Farms, plural with an S, in Lexington, 60 miles northeast. The premier breeding and training facility owned by Harrison Fletcher, distant relation Rowan had never met. Not Fletcher Farm, singular, the struggling small operation owned by a man just trying to keep the lights on. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was a clerical error of catastrophic proportions. He should call immediately, contact the transport company, notify the intended recipient, arrange for the mare's pickup. Every logical thought in his head screamed that keeping quiet, even for an hour, was wrong. But Elowin hadn't moved from her position at the third stall. Her dark eyes watched him with an intensity that felt almost human. And deep in Rowan's chest, something he couldn't name whispered that there was more to this story than a simple mistake in addresses. His phone was already in his hand when he heard the creak of wood, a sound so faint he almost missed it. The mare's ear twitched, rotating toward the sound. Rowan followed her gaze to the back wall of the barn, where morning light revealed something he'd never noticed in all his years on the property. Carved into the weathered wood, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, was a name. Eclipse. Rowan ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades. The lettering was precise, done by someone with skill and care. Around it, barely visible in the aged wood, were other markings, dates, measurements, notes about feed and training schedules. This hadn't been random graffiti. This had been documentation, professional documentation. Elowin stood beside him now, her warm breath misting in the cool barn air. She reached out with her muzzle and touched the carving, then released a soft nicker that resonated in the quiet space. "You know this place," Rowan whispered. "Don't you, girl?" His phone buzzed. A text from Marlowe Chen, his nearest neighbor and the owner of the property's best-maintained fencing. She ran a small veterinary practice specializing in equine care and had become one of his few friends in the years since the divorce. "Saw the fancy trailer. You win the lottery or rob a bank," Rowan typed back quickly. "Long story. Can you come over? Need your professional opinion on something. Give me 20 minutes. He used the time to get Elowin settled in a clean stall, not the third one she'd been drawn to, but the largest one with fresh bedding and good ventilation. She went reluctantly, constantly looking back at that damaged stall as if it held secrets only she could see. Rowan filled water buckets and distributed hay, his mind racing. The farm had been in his family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had built the barn in 1952. His grandfather, Thomas Fletcher, had run a small but respected breeding operation through the 70s and 80s, before the market crashed and larger facilities drove out the small operators. By the time Rowan's father inherited it, the horse business was already a memory, the barn repurposed for storing equipment and sheltering the occasional rescue animal. But those carvings, those were from the breeding operation era. Someone had documented a horse named Eclipse here, decades ago. Marlowe arrived in her battered pickup, medical kit in hand. She was 40, sharp-featured and sharper-minded, with salt and pepper hair she kept in a practical braid. Her eyes went wide when she saw Elowin. "Rowan Fletcher, what have you done?" "Nothing, I swear." He explained the morning's events while Marlowe approached Eloan with the careful respect of a professional. The mare accepted her examination with regal patience, as if being assessed by strangers was routine. "She's spectacular," Marlowe murmured, running her hands down Eloan's legs, checking her teeth, listening to her heart and lungs. "Perfect condition, professional care, expensive feed, regular farrier work. This animal's worth more than both our properties combined." She straightened, fixing Rowan with a penetrating stare. "And you're telling me she just showed up? It was supposed to go to Harrison Fletcher's place in Lexington. Wrong Fletcher. So call them. Get her picked up before you're liable for her." "I will. But Marlowe, look at this first." He led her to the back wall, showed her the carvings. Marlowe produced a flashlight from her kit, examining the marks with professional thoroughness. "Eclipse," she read aloud. "Fold April 15th, 1984. By midnight storm out of silver morning. Training notes, jumping measurements." She trailed off, her expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. "Rowan, these are breeding records. Professional ones. My grandfather's operation. But Eclipse isn't a common name, and Eloan's registered name is Eloan's Eclipse." Marlowe turned to look at the mare, who was watching them from her stall with unwavering attention. "You don't think that she's descended from a horse born on this property?" "Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm thinking." Marlowe pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Give me a minute. I've got access to some breeding databases." She worked in concentrated silence while Rowan checked on Eloan, offering her a carrot from the bag he kept for his rescue horses. The mare took it with delicate precision, her lips soft against his palm. "Found it," Marlowe said abruptly. "Eclipse, Dutch warm-blood mare, foaled 1984 at Fletcher Farm, Kentucky. Sire, midnight storm, dam, silver morning. Sold at auction in 1986 to," she scrolled, "Thornhill Equestrian Center in Virginia. And here's where it gets interesting. Eclipse became a foundation mare for their breeding program. Multiple champions in her line, including—" She looked up, her eyes wide. "Eloan's Eclipse. 4 generations down. One of the most successful sport horses of her generation." Rowan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "So this isn't a coincidence?" "I don't see how it could be. Eloan's registered owner is—" Marlowe scrolled again. "Thessaly Thornhill. That name mean anything to you?" But Rowan was already moving to his farmhouse, Marlowe following. Inside, he headed straight for the spare bedroom that served as storage for his grandfather's things. Boxes of papers, photographs, and documents his father had never sorted through. Rowan had been meaning to organize them for years, but had never found the time or emotional energy. Now, he tore through boxes with purpose. "What are we looking for?" Marlowe asked. "I don't know. Anything about the breeding operation. Sales records, correspondence, anything that might explain why someone would send $1 million horse to this specific address." They worked through the afternoon, dust motes dancing in the weak November sunlight that filtered through the windows. Most of the documents were mundane: feed receipts, veterinary bills, equipment maintenance logs. But in the third box, buried beneath a stack of competition programs from long-defunct shows, Rowan found a leather-bound ledger. His grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, meticulous records of every horse that had passed through Fletcher Farm. Breeding dates, foaling complications, training progress, sales information. Rowan ran his finger down the entries until he found it. Eclipse, foaled, April 15th, 1984. Exceptional conformation, natural jumper. Sold, September 12th, 1986, Thornhill Equestrian Center, $15,000. Beside the entry in pencil was a note in different handwriting, promised to bring her home someday. "Margaret Thornhill," Marlowe read over his shoulder. "Mother or grandmother to Thessaly, maybe." Rowan turned the page. More entries, more horses. The slow decline of an operation that couldn't compete with the industry's changing economics. But tucked between pages dated 1987 was a photograph. Faded, but still clear enough to make out details. It showed a young woman, perhaps 30, standing beside a bay mare in front of this very barn. The woman's hand rested on the horse's neck with obvious affection. On the back, in the same handwriting as the ledger, Maggie and Eclipse, last day, September 1986. She didn't want to sell, Rowan said quietly. No one wants to sell when times are hard. But your grandfather did what he had to do to keep the farm running. And now, nearly 40 years later, Eclipse's great-great-granddaughter shows up here, delivered to the wrong address. Rowan looked at Marlowe. Except I don't think it's the wrong address at all. Before Marlowe could respond, her phone rang. She answered, listened, her expression growing concerned. That was my assistant. Someone called the clinic looking for me, asking if I'd seen an expensive show jumper. They're checking all the equine vets in the region. They're looking for her. And they're going to find her, Rowan. That horse has a microchip. They can track her exact location within hours once they really start looking. Rowan walked to the window, looking out at the barn where Elowen waited. The smart thing, the legal thing, was to call right now, report the mistake, arrange pickup, forget this ever happened. But that note, promised to bring her home someday, echoed in his mind. 24 hours, he said. Give me 24 hours to figure out what's really going on here. If this was intentional, someone went to a lot of trouble. I want to know why before she disappears into some facility where I'll never get answers. Marlowe was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. 24 hours. But Rowan, if this goes sideways, it could ruin you. She's worth more than everything you own. I know. After Marlowe left, Rowan returned to the barn. Evening was falling, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Elowen stood in her stall, regal and patient. When she saw him, she nickered softly, a sound of recognition, almost of greeting. Rowan opened the stall door and stepped inside. The mare didn't move away. Instead, she lowered her head, allowing him to stroke her neck. Her coat was warm beneath his hand, her muscles powerful but relaxed. "Who sent you here, girl?" he whispered. "And what am I supposed to do about it?" Elowen had no answers, but as darkness fell over the small farm, Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something profound. A mystery that connected past and present. A promise made decades ago that someone, somehow, was trying to keep. Rowan barely slept that night. He spent hours at his grandfather's old desk, surrounded by documents and photographs, trying to piece together a story that made sense. The ledger revealed more than he'd initially seen, notes in the margins, references to phone calls and meetings, the slow unraveling of a dream as Fletcher Farm's breeding operation became unsustainable. By dawn, he had a timeline. His grandfather, Thomas Fletcher, had been a skilled horseman but a poor businessman. Through the early 1980s, he'd produced several successful sport horses, including Eclipse, but the industry was consolidating. Larger facilities with deeper pockets dominated the market. By 1986, Thomas was facing foreclosure. The sale of Eclipse to Margaret Thornhill hadn't been just business. The correspondence Rowan found suggested a friendship between his grandfather and the Thornhill family. Margaret had paid fair market value, but there were letters indicating she understood the financial pressure Thomas was under. She'd even offered to buy other horses to help keep the farm afloat. It hadn't been enough. But the letters also revealed something else. Margaret Thornhill had been moved by Eclipse's connection to the farm. In one letter, written in elegant cursive on expensive stationery, she'd written, "I promise to honor her legacy and ensure her bloodline thrives. And perhaps, Thomas, if circumstances allow, we might find a way to bring her story full circle someday." Rowan was still processing this when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Fletcher?" A woman's voice, older, with the cultured accent of old Virginia money. "My name is Thessaly Thornhill. I believe you may have received an unexpected delivery yesterday." His heart rate spiked. "Ms. Thornhill, I was about to call—" "I'm sure you were. Please, let me explain before you say anything more." She paused, and Rowan could hear the emotion underlying her composed tone. "My grandmother, Margaret Thornhill, passed away 6 weeks ago. She was 87 years old, and until the very end, she spoke often of a mare named Eclipse and a farm in Kentucky where that mare was born." Rowan sank into his desk chair. "Eclipse was my grandfather's horse." "Yes, and Elowen's Eclipse is her great-great-granddaughter, the finest sport horse our facility has ever produced, and that's saying something." Thessaly's voice grew softer. "In my grandmother's will, there were unusual instructions. She wanted Elowen returned to Fletcher Farm, not sold, not relocated to another training facility, returned to a small operation that hasn't bred horses in 40 years. That doesn't make sense. It did to her. My grandmother never forgot the horses she'd bought from your grandfather, Mr. Fletcher. She spoke of him as a man who understood breeding at a level that went beyond business. He cared about the animals themselves, their potential, their dignity. When she bought Eclipse, she saw it as a rescue as much as an acquisition." Rowan thought of his grandfather, dead for 15 years now, who'd never recovered from losing the farm's breeding operation. She kept her promise. She tried to keep many promises. This was one of them. Thessaly sighed. "I'll be honest with you, I fought this decision. Elowen is worth well over $1 million. She has years of competition potential ahead of her. The thought of sending her to—" She hesitated. "Forgive me, but to a property that no longer operates as a professional facility seemed irrational." "So why did you do it?" "Because my grandmother's lawyer made it clear that this bequest was non-negotiable. Either I honored her wishes regarding Elowen, or the estate would be tied up in probate for years. And because—" Another pause. "Because I went through her papers after she died, and I found things I'd never known. Letters from your grandfather, photographs, records showing that Eclipse wasn't just another acquisition. She was a beloved animal that my grandmother felt guilty about buying from a man in desperate circumstances." Rowan stood, pacing his small kitchen. "Miss Thornhill, I appreciate the call, but I can't keep her. I don't have the facilities, the expertise, or frankly the money to maintain a horse of her caliber." "I understand, but there's more." Thessaly's voice took on a note of urgency. "My grandmother's instructions specified that Elowen should remain at your property for 30 days. After that period, you're free to make whatever arrangements you feel are appropriate, including returning her to our facility. She established a trust to cover all expenses during that time and compensated you for your trouble." "A trust?" $10,000 for the month, plus all feed, veterinary care, and facilities improvements needed to properly care for her. "My grandmother was many things, Mr. Fletcher, but she wasn't impractical. She knew your farm might need upgrades." Rowan's mind reeled. "Why 30 days?" "I don't know. The lawyer said my grandmother believed that amount of time was necessary for something. She wouldn't elaborate, just insisted on 30 days at Fletcher Farm before any other decisions could be made." "This is insane." "I'm not disagreeing." For the first time, Thessaly's composure cracked slightly. "But it's what she wanted, and I've come to realize that my grandmother rarely did things without reason, even when those reasons weren't immediately apparent." Rowan returned to the window, looking out at the barn where Elowen waited. "What happens if I refuse?" "Legally, the trust stipulation stands regardless. But Elowen would need to be housed somewhere, and I'd have to fight my grandmother's estate in court to regain custody. It would be expensive, time-consuming, and frankly disrespectful to her memory. I'm asking you to honor her wishes, Mr. Fletcher. Give it 30 days. See what happens." "See what happens," Rowan repeated. "She's a horse, Miss Thornhill. A very expensive horse, but still a horse. What exactly is supposed to happen?" The silence that followed was long enough that Rowan thought the connection had dropped. Then Thessaly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother said Eclipse understood things, that she was special, and she believed Elowen inherited that quality. I never knew what she meant, but she insisted that if Elowen was brought back to where her bloodline began, something important would be revealed. That's cryptic, mystical, irrational? Yes, but it's what she believed." Thessaly's professional composure returned. "I'll have papers delivered to you this afternoon, along with contact information for a local veterinarian we work with and a feed supplier who can provide Elowen's specific dietary requirements. All expenses will be handled through the trust. After 30 days, we'll talk again. Does that work for you?" Rowan thought about his mortgage payment, the barn roof that needed repairs, the hay supplier he owed money to. $10,000 would buy him breathing room he desperately needed. But taking it felt wrong, like profiting from something he didn't understand. "One condition," he said. "I want copies of any letters or documents your grandmother kept related to my grandfather and Eclipse. If I'm doing this, I want to know the whole story." "Agreed. I'll have them scanned and sent to you." After they ended the call, Rowan walked back to the barn. Morning light filled the space with warmth, transforming the weathered boards into something almost beautiful. Elowen stood in her stall, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. 30 days, he told her. Your owner, former owner, wants you here for 30 days. Any idea why? Elowen stamped a hoof, then turned her attention back to the third stall, the one with the broken latch and crooked door. She'd been fixated on it since arrival. Rowan approached it slowly. In all his years on the property, he'd never really examined this stall. It was just storage, old tack, broken equipment, things his father had meant to fix or throw away, but never got around to. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, he noticed things. The door hung crooked because the hinges had been modified, probably to accommodate some specific need. The walls showed marks where equipment had been mounted, specialized brackets, now empty. And in the far corner, beneath a pile of ancient horse blankets, the floorboards looked different, newer, or rather, replaced. Rowan pulled away the blankets, revealing boards that didn't match the rest of the stall's flooring. They'd been cut to fit, nailed down, but they were clearly not original. He knelt, running his fingers along the edges, and felt a gap. His heart pounding, he retrieved a crowbar from his truck. The boards came up with surprising ease, revealing a shallow space beneath, just deep enough to hide something flat. Inside was a metal box, sealed against moisture. Rowan lifted it out, his hands shaking. The box was locked, but the mechanism was old. A few minutes with a screwdriver, and the lid popped open. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs. Lots of photographs. Rowan carried the box into the light, spreading its contents across a hay bale. What he found made his breath catch. There were dozens of photos of Eclipse, as a foal, as a young horse in training, at competitions. But mixed among them were pictures of two people, his grandfather and a young Margaret Thornhill. Not just professional photographs, but candid shots. Thomas and Margaret laughing together, Margaret riding Eclipse, while Thomas watched with obvious pride. The two of them having dinner at what looked like a farm celebration. There were letters too, not business correspondence, but personal ones. Written in the years after Eclipse's sale, they revealed a relationship Rowan had never known existed. A deep friendship, possibly more, between two people whose lives had taken different paths. "I miss our conversations," Margaret had written in one letter dated 1989. "The horses we talk about at Thornhill are magnificent, but no one here understands them the way you did, Thomas. Eclipse still has that quality you recognized in her, that intelligence, that presence. Sometimes I swear she's looking back toward Kentucky, remembering where she came from." Thomas's replies were there too, carbon copies he'd kept. "I think about the farm every day, Maggie. What it was, what it could have been. Eclipse was special. You were right to take her, but God, I miss seeing her develop. I miss knowing what became of all that potential." The letters continued for years, growing more personal, more emotional. It became clear that Margaret and Thomas had cared deeply for each other, but circumstances, his failing farm, her family's expectations, the physical distance between Kentucky and Virginia, had kept them apart. The final letter in the collection was dated 2008, a year before Thomas died. "Maggie, knowing you kept Eclipse's line going means more to me than you'll ever understand. Those horses carry something special, not just genetics, but a spirit we both recognized. I made you a promise once that I'd find a way to preserve what we started together. I couldn't keep that promise. But maybe you can keep it for both of us. Bring them home someday. Let them remember where they came from." Rowan sat back, emotion welling in his chest. His grandfather had been more than just a struggling horse breeder. He'd been someone who'd loved deeply, dreamed big, and lost much. And Margaret Thornhill had spent 40 years honoring a connection that had never quite become what both of them had wanted. Eloan's delivery wasn't just about fulfilling a promise to return a bloodline to its origins. It was about completing a love story that had never had its proper ending. The next week transformed Fletcher Farm in ways Rowan couldn't have imagined. True to her word, Thessaly arranged for everything Eloan needed. A team arrived to repair the barn roof, upgrade the stalls, and install proper drainage. Premium feed was delivered. Marlowe stopped by daily to check on Eloan's condition, increasingly impressed with how the mare was settling in. "She's content here," Marlowe observed on the 5th day, watching Eloan graze in the pasture. "I've worked with enough high-performance horses to know when they're stressed by a change in environment. She's not. If anything, she seems relaxed, happier." Rowan had noticed the same thing. Eloan moved around the property with an ease that suggested familiarity, even though she'd never been here before. She gravitated to certain spots: the oak tree at the pasture's edge, a particular corner of the barn, the old water trough that Rowan's grandfather had carved his initials into decades ago. It was impossible, he knew. Horses didn't inherit memories. They didn't carry genetic knowledge of places their ancestors had lived, and yet Eloan's behavior suggested exactly that. He'd spent hours reading through the documents Thessaly sent, scanned copies of every letter, every photograph, every record Margaret Thornhill had kept of her relationship with Thomas Fletcher. The picture that emerged was of two people who'd found something rare in each other, a shared understanding of what made certain horses special, a mutual respect for the difficult balance between business and genuine care for animals, and a connection they'd never quite been able to act on. Margaret had married someone from her social circle, had children, built a successful breeding operation. Thomas had stayed in Kentucky, struggled to keep his farm, eventually lost the breeding business but held onto the land. They'd written to each other for years, their letters a thread of continuity through all the changes in their lives, and Eclipse had been at the heart of it all. On the 8th day, Rowan decided to try something. He opened the 3rd stall, the one Eloan had been drawn to, the one where he'd found the hidden box. He'd cleaned it out, repaired the door, added fresh bedding. Now he led Eloan to it. She entered without hesitation, immediately moving to the back corner where the floorboards had been replaced. She lowered her head, sniffing the wood, then looked at Rowan with such intentness that he felt compelled to speak. "I found what was hidden here," he told her, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to a horse about such things. Letters from your great-great-great-grandmother's owner to my grandfather. Love letters, really. Or as close as two people could get who couldn't quite figure out how to be together. Elowen stamped a hoof, the sound echoing in the quiet stall. Margaret, your original owner, she cared about Eclipse the way my grandfather did, not just as an investment or a competition horse, but as, I don't know, a partner, someone who understood things. Rowan leaned against the stall wall. And now you're here, 40 years later, because she wanted you to see where it all started, where Eclipse was born, where two people fell in love over a shared dream that didn't work out the way they'd hoped. The mare moved closer, her warm breath on his shoulder. Rowan reached up to stroke her neck, and for a moment in the quiet of that stall, he felt connected to something larger than himself. A continuity of care and understanding that spanned generations. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. This is Callum Thornhill, Thessaly's son. I'm going to be in your area tomorrow. Would it be possible to visit and see how Elowen is settling in? Rowan typed back, of course. Any time after 9 a.m. works. The next morning brought cold rain, the kind that turned dirt roads to mud and made barn work miserable. Rowan was in the middle of mucking stalls when a Range Rover pulled up and a man in his early 30s emerged. He wore expensive casual clothes that somehow remained clean despite the weather, and he moved with the confidence of someone raised with privilege. Mr. Fletcher? He extended a hand. Callum Thornhill? Thanks for agreeing to meet. Call me Rowan. They shook, and Rowan led him to the barn. She's in here. Callum's practiced composure cracked when he saw Elowen. Jesus, she looks good. I was worried this environment might... He stopped himself. Sorry, that came out wrong. It's fine. I know this isn't a world-class facility. That's not what I meant. Callum approached Elowen slowly, speaking to her in a low voice. The mare nickered in recognition, allowing him to run his hands over her legs and check her overall condition. I've known this horse since she was born, helped train her, competed with her. I was against my grandmother's decision to send her here, thought it was... He paused. Crazy? Rowan supplied. Sentimental to the point of irresponsibility. Elowen represents years of breeding investment, training, potential stud fees. Having her here instead of competing or producing offspring seemed like a waste. Callum straightened, meeting Rowan's eyes. I was wrong. How so? Because I can see what my grandmother saw. Elowen's not stressed. She's not pacing or showing any signs of distress. If anything, she looks more settled than I've ever seen her. He glanced around the barn, taking in the repairs, the clean stalls, the obvious care evident in every detail. You're taking good care of her. Trying to. Your mother's trust fund makes it possible. The trust fund is the least of it. Callum moved to the stall Elowen had been fixated on, the one where Rowan had found the hidden documents. My grandmother told me stories when I was young, about Eclipse, about your grandfather, about the farm where everything started. I thought they were just stories, nostalgia from an old woman who romanticized the past. They weren't stories. I found proof. Letters, photographs, records. My grandfather and your grandmother. Rowan struggled for the right words. Loved each other. I know. Callum's expression softened. After she died, my mother and I went through her personal effects. She'd kept everything, every letter your grandfather ever sent her, every photograph of Eclipse, every reminder of what might have been. It was like discovering a whole other life she'd lived in parallel to the one we knew. I'm sorry. Don't be. It explained so much about her. Why she was so passionate about preserving Eclipse's line. Why she insisted on certain training methods that emphasized the horse's autonomy and intelligence over pure performance. why she talked about honoring the animal in ways that made her seem eccentric to other breeders. Callum smiled sadly. She wasn't eccentric. She was keeping a promise to someone she'd loved. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Elowen. Then Callum spoke again, his voice uncertain. "Can I tell you something that's going to sound insane? After the last week I've had, I'm not sure anything sounds insane anymore. My grandmother said Eclipse could sense things. Not supernatural things," he added quickly, "but emotional truths. She claimed Eclipse knew when people were genuine in their care for horses versus when they saw them as investments. That Eclipse could sense the difference between a rider who respected her and one who just wanted to win. That doesn't sound insane. Horses are perceptive animals." But my grandmother took it further. She said Eclipse seemed to understand legacy, that certain horses carried not just genetic traits, but something deeper. A memory of care, of the people who'd loved them. Callum met Rowan's eyes. She believed that bringing Elowen here would prove that theory, that Elowen would recognize this place even though she'd never been here before. Rowan thought about Elowen's immediate gravitation to specific locations, her focus on the third stall, the way she moved around the property with eerie familiarity. What if she was right? Then we're witnessing something remarkable. Not supernatural, but... Callum struggled for words. Maybe a demonstration of how deeply connection and care can be imprinted. How the relationship between humans and horses can transcend time. Before Rowan could respond, Elowen did something unexpected. She moved to the stall door, pushed it open with her nose. She'd learned the latch mechanism in less than a day, and walked directly to the third stall. She stood at its entrance, turning to look at both men expectantly. "She wants us to follow her," Rowan said. They did. Inside the stall, Elowen moved to the exact spot where Rowan had found the hidden box. She pawed at the floorboards, gently, deliberately. Then she looked at Callum with such intensity that he actually stepped back. "What is she—" Callum started. Rowan knelt, examining the boards. Something about them looked odd. A variation in wood grain, a slight discoloration. He retrieved his crowbar again, working carefully. These boards came up even easier than the first ones, revealing another shallow space. Inside was a second box, smaller, more weathered, but sealed just as carefully. Rowan lifted it out with shaking hands. This lock was more stubborn, but eventually yielded. Inside were more documents, but different ones. Legal papers, contracts, and a letter addressed to whoever brings Eclipse's line home. Rowan opened the letter, written in Thomas Fletcher's handwriting, dated a week before his death. "If you're reading this, it means Maggie kept her promise. She said she'd find a way to bring Eclipse's legacy back to where it started. I didn't believe her, didn't think it was possible. But Maggie never made promises she couldn't keep. In this box are the original breeding records for Fletcher Farm, not the edited versions I gave to buyers, but the real ones. They show bloodlines that go back further than anyone knew. Eclipse wasn't just a good horse. She was descended from foundation stock that helped establish the American warm blood line in the 1950s. I sold those records to Maggie when I sold Eclipse. I needed the money to save the farm. It didn't work. The farm failed anyway. But I made her promise to keep those records safe and to one day bring them back here if she could. They're worth more than money. They're history. They're proof that small operations like ours mattered, that the horses we bred carried something special forward. If Maggie's bringing Eclipse's line home, it means she never forgot, never gave up on what we dreamed about. I hope whoever's reading this understands how rare that is, how precious. Some connections transcend time and circumstance. Some promises are worth keeping for a lifetime. Take care of these records. They belong here, with the land where it all started. And take care of Eclipse's descendants. They carry something precious, not just good bloodlines, but the memory of care from people who loved them not for what they could win, but for who they were. Thomas Fletcher, September 2008. Rowan's hands trembled as he lowered the letter. Inside the box were thick folders, breeding records dating back to 1952, showing lineages that connected Fletcher Farm to some of the most influential sport horse lines in American history. Documents that proved his grandfather's modest operation had been part of something significant, even if the world had forgotten. Callum was reading over his shoulder, his expression awed. These records, these are historical documents. They fill in gaps in breeding databases that have been mysteries for decades. My grandfather sold them to your grandmother to save the farm, and she kept them safe, waiting for the right time to return them. Callum looked at Elowen, who stood calmly in the stall as if satisfied now that her job was complete. She used Elowen to bring them home. Used the one horse valuable enough that we'd have to honor her strange bequest, knowing Elowen would lead you to this. How could she have known Elowen would do that? I don't think she did. Not for certain, but she believed in the connection between Eclipse and this place, believed that horses remember in their own way, and she was right. Rowan stood, looking at the documents that represented his grandfather's legacy, a legacy he'd never known existed. What happens now? Now? Callum smiled. Now we honor records both belong their here, promises. But they need to be preserved, digitized, shared with breeding registries. Your grandfather's work deserves recognition. And Elowen, that's up to you. The 30 days aren't over yet. But I think... Callum paused, choosing his words carefully. I think my grandmother wanted you to have a choice, to see what Elowen means, what she represents. Not just as a valuable horse, but as a living connection to everything your grandfather built and my grandmother preserved. The remaining days of the 30-day period passed with a rhythm Rowan hadn't experienced since childhood. He woke early to care for Elowen, spent his mornings working on the property improvements that Thessaly's trust made possible, and his afternoons diving deeper into the documents his grandfather had left behind. Marlowe helped him organize everything, her methodical veterinary mind, perfect for cataloguing and cross-referencing the breeding records. Together, they discovered connections that told a story larger than either of them had imagined. Your grandfather wasn't just breeding horses, Marlowe said one afternoon, surrounded by papers in Rowan's kitchen. He was preserving genetics that might have been lost otherwise. Some of these bloodlines, their foundations for entire disciplines in modern sport horses. He died thinking he'd failed. He didn't fail, he just couldn't see far enough forward to know what he'd accomplished. Callum visited twice more during those weeks, each time spending hours with Elowen and studying the documents. He arranged for experts from various breeding registries to examine the records, and word began to spread in the equine world about what had been discovered at the small Fletcher farm in Kentucky. But the real change was happening in Rowan himself. He'd spent 3 years since his divorce in a holding pattern, keeping the farm running, doing enough to survive, but never really living. Elowen's arrival had cracked something open in him. Working with her, learning her personality, understanding the care and dedication required to maintain a horse of her caliber, it reminded him why his grandfather had loved this work. It wasn't about money or prestige. It was about the relationship between human and animal, the partnership that emerged when both parties respected each other's capabilities and needs. On the 28th day, Thessaly called. "The 30 days are almost up," she said without preamble. "I need to know your decision about Elowen." Rowan had known this conversation was coming. He'd thought about little else for the past week. "Can I ask you something first?" "Of course. Why did your mother really do this? I've read all the letters." Studied the records, heard the stories, but I still don't understand why she went to such elaborate lengths to get Eloan here. Thessaly was quiet for a long moment. My mother spent her entire adult life in the breeding business. She was good at it, brilliant even, built our operation into one of the most respected in the country, but she always said something was missing, a connection she'd had with horses when she was younger, before business and competition and market forces became the primary considerations. With Eclipse, and with your grandfather. They saw horses as partners, not assets, as individuals with their own intelligence and dignity, not just vehicles for human ambition. Thessaly's voice grew soft. My mother believed that modern breeding had lost something essential, that we'd become so focused on performance metrics and genetic markers that we'd forgotten about the animals themselves. So this was about proving a point? No, it was about keeping a promise and giving you a choice. Thessaly paused. My mother knew your financial situation, Rowan. She knew sending a Loan to you, along with the resources to care for her, would give you options you didn't have before. She wanted you to experience what your grandfather experienced, what it meant to care for a horse like Eclipse's descendant. And then she wanted you to choose freely what happened next. Choose what? Whether Eloan stays with you or returns to us. Whether you want to rebuild what your grandfather started or move forward in a different direction. Thessaly's tone became businesslike. The trust I mentioned, it wasn't just for 30 days. My mother established a permanent fund, $300,000, to support whatever you decide. If you want to keep Eloan, use it to upgrade your facilities and establish a small breeding or training operation. If you want to return her, use it to transform Fletcher Farm into whatever you dream of. Rowan felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. $300,000? My mother was wealthy, Rowan, and she had no regrets about spending money on things that mattered to her. This mattered. Thessaly's voice softened again. She couldn't bring your grandfather back, couldn't undo the circumstances that kept them apart or the failures that cost him his breeding operation. But she could give his grandson a chance to choose the life he wanted, without financial desperation forcing his hand the way it forced your grandfather's. Rowan walked to his window, looking out at Eloan in the pasture. She stood beneath the old oak tree, head raised, looking toward the barn with that same intelligent awareness he'd come to recognize. 28 days had transformed her from an unexpected delivery into something else entirely. A responsibility, yes, but also a connection to a past he'd never fully understood and a future he hadn't dared to imagine. I've been offered a position, he said quietly. Training assistant at Harrison Fletcher's facility in Lexington. Good salary, benefits, the chance to work with world-class horses. And, Thessaly prompted, and I've been thinking about what my grandfather would want. Whether he'd tell me to take the secure job or to try rebuilding what he lost. What do you think he'd want? Rowan closed his eyes, remembering the letters, the photographs, the passion evident in every line of his grandfather's breeding records. I think he'd tell me to stop trying to live his life and start living my own. That sounds wise, which is why I'm keeping Eloan. The words came out with more certainty than Rowan had expected. Not to recreate what my grandfather had, but to create something new, something that honors what he and your mother both believed in, that horses like Eloan deserve to be treated as partners, not just assets. What will you do? Start small. Use the trust to upgrade the facilities properly. Offer boarding and training for owners who want a more individualized approach than the big facilities provide. Maybe, eventually, breed a foal or two from Eloan's line. He smiled. Not a breeding empire, just a sustainable operation that treats horses the way my grandfather and your mother believed they should be treated. She would have liked that. Tell me something. Did your mother really believe Elowen would lead me to those hidden documents, or was that just a happy accident? Thessaly laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. My mother said something to me a week before she died. She said, "Horses remember what humans forget." Eclipse remembered Thomas's farm. Her descendants will remember too, in their own way. And when Elowen goes home, she'll make sure the past isn't lost. That's impossible. Is it? You tell me. You're the one who watched her behavior these past 4 weeks. Rowan thought about Elowen's immediate gravitation to specific locations, her fixation on the third stall, the way she'd pawed at the exact spot where the second box was hidden. I don't know what to call it. Instinct, genetic memory, sensitivity to environmental cues humans miss. Does it matter what we call it? No, I suppose it doesn't. Rowan made his decision. I'm keeping her, Thessaly. I'll use the trust wisely, build something sustainable. And I'll make sure Eclipse's legacy and your mother's is honored. Thank you. Thessaly's relief was audible. She left one more thing for you. A letter to be delivered only if you chose to keep Elowen. I'll have it sent express. You should receive it tomorrow. They ended the call, and Rowan walked out to the pasture. Elowen saw him coming, meeting him halfway with that smooth, powerful gait that spoke of perfect conditioning and natural athleticism. She nuzzled his shoulder, her breath warm in the cold air. "You're staying," he told her. "I hope you know what you're getting into. This isn't going to be a fancy competition facility. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of learning, and probably a lot of mistakes." Elowen stamped a hoof, as if in agreement or approval. Rowan couldn't tell which. The letter arrived the next morning as promised. Thick paper, elegant handwriting, Margaret Thornhill's final message to a man she'd never met. "Dear Rowan, if you're reading this, you've made a choice that honors both your grandfather's legacy and my own dreams for what horse breeding could be. I never met you, and I suspect you knew little or nothing about me until Elowen arrived at your farm. But I feel I know you anyway, because you're Thomas's grandson, and Thomas was one of the finest men I ever knew. We had different lives, he and I, different circumstances, different opportunities. But we shared a vision of what our work with horses could mean, not just producing champions, but creating partnerships based on mutual respect and understanding. I spent 40 years building Thornhill Equestrian into a successful business. I'm proud of that achievement, but my proudest accomplishment was keeping Eclipse's line alive and ensuring her descendants inherited not just her physical traits, but something deeper, her intelligence, her dignity, her capacity for connection. Elowen is the culmination of that work. She's everything I dreamed Eclipse's line could become, and now she's home, in the place where it all began. The money I've left you isn't charity. It's an investment in a vision your grandfather and I shared, a vision that values horses as individuals, not commodities. Use it to build something that reflects that vision, whatever form that takes. Some people will think I'm a sentimental old woman wasting resources on nostalgia. Let them think what they want. I know what matters. And what matters is keeping promises, honoring connections that transcend time and circumstance, and ensuring that the best of what we build survives us. Thomas never got to see what Eclipse's line became. But you can. You can ensure that Elowen's descendants carry forward something precious, not just good genetics, but the memory of care from people who loved horses for who they are, not just for what they can win. That's the real legacy. Not ribbons or championships or breeding fees, but the continuity of care and respect across generations. Thank you for giving Elowen a home. Thank you for honoring your grandfather's work. And thank you for proving that some connections really do transcend time. With gratitude and respect, Margaret Thornhill Rowan folded the letter carefully, his throat tight with emotion. He understood now, truly understood, what Margaret and his grandfather had created together. Not just a bloodline of exceptional horses, but a philosophy about what it meant to work with animals with respect and genuine care. That evening, he stood in the barn while Elowen settled in for the night. The repairs were complete, the space transformed from a weathered relic into a functional facility, but it still carried the bones of what his grandfather had built, the history evident in every beam and board. Marlowe arrived with paperwork, forms to establish Fletcher Farm as a licensed boarding and training facility, applications for the necessary permits, a business plan they'd developed together over the past weeks. "You're really doing this," she said, watching Rowan sign the documents. "I'm really doing this. Your grandfather would be proud." "I hope so." Rowan set down the pen, looking at Elowen. "I keep thinking about what Margaret said in her letter, about some connections transcending time, about promises that are worth keeping across decades. You believe that now? I don't know if I believe in genetic memory or horses that can sense emotional truths or any of the mystical-sounding things Margaret talked about." Rowan smiled. "But I believe in continuity of care. I believe in honoring the people who came before us and the work they did. And I believe Elowen belongs here, in the place where her ancestor was born and where two people loved each other enough to spend 40 years keeping promises neither of them thought they could keep. That's not mystical. That's just being human. Maybe that's enough." As winter deepened over Fletcher Farm, changes continued. Word spread about the rediscovered breeding records, and historians from major registries came to document everything. Rowan gave interviews, shared his grandfather's story, and watched as Thomas Fletcher's work received the recognition it had always deserved. But the real transformation was quieter, more personal. Fletcher Farm began taking boarders, owners who wanted their horses treated as individuals, who valued the personalized attention Rowan could provide over the prestige of a larger facility. Marlowe became a consulting partner, ensuring all veterinary care met the highest standards. And Elowen settled into her new home with a contentment that Rowan could only describe as recognition. She moved through the property with confidence, greeted each day with energy, and seemed to understand that she'd completed a journey decades in the making. On the anniversary of her arrival, exactly 1 year later, Rowan stood in the pasture at dawn, watching Elowen graze. The property looked different now. Fences repaired, barn restored, new outbuildings constructed to accommodate the growing operation. But it still felt like the same place, carrying the same spirit his grandfather had imbued it with all those years ago. His phone buzzed, a text from Callum. "How's our girl doing?" Rowan smiled, typing back, "She's home." And she was. Against all logic, against all probability, a $1 million show jumper had found her way to a small farm in Kentucky, not because of a mistake, but because of a promise kept across 40 years, a love that had transcended circumstance, and a belief that some connections really do matter more than money or prestige or any practical consideration. Elowen raised her head, looking toward the barn where morning light was beginning to paint the weathered boards in gold. In that moment, Rowan could swear he saw something in her eyes, recognition, maybe, or satisfaction, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Welcome home, girl," he said softly. "Welcome home." And in the quiet of that Kentucky morning, with frost sparkling on the grass and the promise of spring already whispering through the winter air, Fletcher Farm began its next chapter, rooted in history, built on promises kept, and dedicated to a vision that valued partnership over profit, care over commerce, and the enduring connection between humans and the remarkable animals who choose to trust them. Some things, Rowan had learned, really do transcend time. Some promises are worth keeping for a lifetime, and some deliveries, even mistaken ones, turn out to be exactly right.